The giant sequoia tree, the tallest, no, not the tallest, but the largest tree in the world, 2,500 years old. Largest in volume. And all the people that came from all over the world to see this one tree.
If there was water, you could take a bath every day for 27 years with the water. Since 2200 years.
Yeah. 103 feet, 31 meters. Wait. 1,000. 1,000. Wait, General Grant, what?
I was just thinking it might be better. Riley, they have some sequoias that are 1,000 years older than that one.
Whoa.
Sherman.
They're smaller?
Well, age-wise, there's apparently some sequoia out here somewhere that's unnamed that are 1,000 years older, and there's some that are almost 100. Well, they're about 40 feet taller, 35 feet taller.
Are you doing a video?
Oh yeah, just videoing, yeah. Go ahead, sir, it's okay. Thank you.
No problem. Popatrz, ja sobie może tu usiądę.
Here, Charles.
Dog insurance? Dog protection?
Okay, ready? Okay, bye, General Sherman.
Welcome to continue to but we're going to be here for a while. 20 minutes, and then the tree is yours. So come on forward. Don't be shy. Welcome.
Oh, it's bigger close up.
Yes. And just so you know, interesting thing, we have a very hard time really accurately gauging just how big this tree is, because our world, we have things that we're familiar with. You know, a car, we know how big it is. A dinner plate, we know how big it is. We don't really have anything that we can use to accurately judge the enormity of this tree. And so one of the things I avoid is a bunch of superlatives and a bunch of facts about the tree, which you can read on the placards there. It's obviously a really impressive tree. So welcome to the General Sherman tree. Welcome to Sequoia National Park, home of the giant forest. This beautiful forest of old growth giant sequoias is why we have a national park here. So we were designated to save this particular grove of redwoods. And then the two parks grew over the decades into the present form that you see, Sequoia here with Mineral King, and our sister park, Kings Canyon, where we share a common border, and we have one superintendent. So while we're really two separate parks, we are administered together. So my name is Paula. I am a seasonal ranger here, and again, I want to welcome you. One of the first questions I like to ask is, how many of you you live here in California and you're visiting from a home here in California? Okay. So what part of California?
Fresno.
Fresno. So you're locals. and I know it's hot. I'm from Sacramento, and it's hot. Where are you folks? Where do you live?
Orange County.
Orange County.
LA.
So inland or on the coast?
I'm on the coast now.
Okay, so a little milder. You're not going to get to the hundreds. Where are you from?
We're from El Cerrito.
Okay, that's the Bay Area, right? Yeah. So Central Valley, coastal, northern coast, southern coast. Anyone visiting from where?
Netherlands.
Where? What's that?
Netherlands.
Netherlands. Okay.
Marin
Anyone-
County.
Where?
Marin County.
Marin County. Nice weather, like the best ever. Anyone else visiting from some other part of the world? Or the United States? Okay, Poland, Netherlands. Anyone visiting from another state here in the United States? All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And the reason I bring that up is if you're from California, whether you're from Marin County or Southern California or the Central Valley or the desert, the one thing that all those climates have in common is a long dry period. So we go months and months without rain. So some places are much hotter than others, like the Central Valley, which is why I like it up here because it's much cooler, or mild, like the north and central coast of California. The one thing that we all have in common is a lack of rainfall in the summertime. And so we really more have a wet season and a dry season. So in the Netherlands, it rains in the summertime, doesn't it? Quite a bit? Yeah? Yeah. In Poland? All the time, yeah. Yeah. So here in California, we do have a drought right now, but even when there's no drought, all of our precipitation falls during the rainy season. I mean, it's hardly measurable outside of that rainy season. And so fire, the one thing I'm going to start with today is fire as an important part of the California ecosystem wherever you are. And the problem with California is we've built our homes in places that normally, historically and prehistorically would burn. And this place that you're standing at right now is one of those places. Long, dry summer. It's mild, but still very dry. And the fire return interval in this forest would be anywhere from 5 to 15 years until European Americans arrived here and saw fire as a destructive force and a thing to be suppressed at all costs. And the problem with that is that had the unintended consequence of changing the forest ecosystem. So we had a fire scientist, not a plant biologist, not a botanist. We had a fire scientist who noticed in the late 60s or in the early to mid 60s, he didn't see any young sequoia. And he's the one who made the connection between suppressing fire and suppressing the germination of the giant sequoia. So what I'm going to do is start by showing you why fire is so important in this particular forest, and frankly everywhere in California. But in particular here, there would be no young sequoias if we hadn't reintroduced fire. And that is because, if you've not seen one, this is the seed of a giant sequoia. That little tiny thing is a seed of a giant sequoia. In fact, you can go ahead and pass that around, and then I'll give you a real chance to look at it, okay? So, I actually like to hold them in my hands. So, these are giant sequoia seeds. Tiny. It does. Kind of a pretty runty grain of oatmeal. So those are giant sequoia seeds. Now when you think about this tiny little seed turning into that spectacular tree behind me, okay, isn't that tiny? Yeah. So one fact that a fellow ranger gave me when I was first learning this job is that the ratio of a tiny seed like this to this tree behind me, this particular sequoia, is the same ratio as this sequoia to the entire planet Earth. And if you think about it, it takes 91,000 of these to equal 1 pound, and this tree weighs something like 1,000,000 tons. So it's, you know, I did some math, and it's actually accurate. So that's an amazing thing. But when you think about this tiny seed, and you look around what we've got now, it would be hard for this little seed to have any chance of germinating and actually growing with all this stuff on the ground. And so that's why fire is so important. It clears off the soil. It gives this little seed a chance to actually contact the soil. It adds minerals and nutrients into what is otherwise a relatively sterile, decomposed granite soil. And so that's the only way these little guys have any kind of chance at all. And it's important because if you go to the Giant Forest Museum later today, I just smelled the first hint of smoke from a prescribed fire that started today. Okay, so we carefully plan out fires, and so this is the this year's fire. So the Giant Forest Museum is right here, and I'll pass this around. And so it's right along the Sunset Rock Trail. And as far as I know, no trail right now is closed to visitors. In fact, I think they kind of want people to see the fire because the way these fires would have burned, we tend to have this image of those Yellowstone fires, right? Where the whole forest was destroyed, where the trees would literally explode into flames. Well, that's a man-made type disaster because for decades and decades, those fires had been suppressed. And so there was a huge fuel load that had built up, and the fires would rage. The natural fires that we're trying to put back, that balance, would stay very low to the ground because there wouldn't be a lot of fuel. You'd only have 5 to 10 years worth of fuel, maybe 15 years worth of fuel. So they would burn low to the ground. And they would not be terribly destructive, and in fact would be healthy for the forest ecosystem, an important part of nature. So as you look at this spectacular tree behind me, what do you notice about it and how it looks? What do you see? Besides it's huge.
Stuff.
What's that?
Green stuff.
Up at the top?
I think he's referring to the moss.
Oh yes. Okay, so a little will grow on giant sequoias, but not nearly as much as you see on other trees. So what else do you notice? If you were going to describe this tree to someone who can't see it, what would be some of the standout features that you would focus on to describe that tree?
It's scraggly. Like it's not formed like a regular tree. It's scraggly at the top.
Okay,
Like,
so what is it?
not
That's
formed.
interesting. What is it about the top?
It just doesn't look like it's not symmetrical.
Okay, it's not symmetrical. Actually, the trunk is remarkably symmetrical, but
Yeah,
the
but the
top,
top
the
is not.
branches are not. What else do you notice? Okay, that's a really important one. So that's a fire adaptation, or at least it's an adaptation that has allowed these trees to survive fire. So one of the things that will kill virtually any tree is a crown fire, a fire all the way up the tree. And so because the branches of a mature sequoia start so high up the tree, fire has little opportunity to reach the crown of the tree, okay? And that's an important adaptation. What else do you notice about this tree? Again, you're describing it to someone who can't see it.
There are holes.
Okay, there are holes in it. So those are actually woodpecker holes. And they don't hurt the tree. What else? Okay, the bark is another fire adaptation. So I'm going to send a piece of bark from a fallen tree, one of my favorite trees that fell last winter. It had a hole in it, burned by fire, and I could fit 22 people in that hole. And the tree was still alive. The tree was still alive, but a windstorm snapped it at a weak spot. So I'm going to pass this around because it's kind of spongy, it's light, it's filled with air. And then how would you describe that color? Kind of red. Does anybody know what causes that red color?
The fire.
The fire made the black marks. Anybody know?
Maybe iron in the ground?
Well, you know what? I don't know where this actually comes from, but that's not what's in the tree. That may be the source of it for the tree. Okay, so there are two things humans consume that have this chemical in them, and the chemical is actually considered an antioxidant, and if these things are consumed, of course in moderation, they're actually considered good for people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, chance to-
What is it? These are things that you would drink. What's red? It's good.
Pomegranate.
Not that may have the same chemical in it. I actually don't know. So red wine
Oh.
and tea.
Is
Does
it
anybody know what
tannin?
chemicals they have in common that are considered healthy in moderation?
Oh, resveratrol? Tannin?
Tannin. That's it. It's tannin. So this bark is filled with tannin, which is a natural fire suppressant. Okay, so it is a chemical that helps the tree survive fire. And so these are the main fire adaptations of these incredible trees. Because anybody read how old this tree is?
2200? 25?
2,200 years old. So if you do just a little bit of math, I'm not very good at math, but if, let's say on average, since the fire return cycle is 5 to 15 years, let's say make it easy for my little brain, and it's every 10 years, this tree could have survived 220 fires, right? All right, so that's a lot. And what has allowed it is these 220 fires possible, okay, is the red tannin in that beautiful bark that helps as a chemical suppressant. The bark is up to 3 feet thick at the base, so like that. All right, amazing. The bark is also, in addition to thick and with tannin in it, is kind of spongy, almost like I equate it to a wetsuit. So it's got air pockets in it that act as an excellent insulator. And the branches start very high off the ground, thereby denying a fire that ladder into the crown. So those are all important fire adaptations. And what our fire scientists found is when we suppressed fire, we started seeing a whole different change, a whole change in the suite of tree species that we would find. So if you look around, we call this the giant forest, but this is a complete ecosystem. This is a mixed conifer forest. So we have the magnificent sugar pine. We have white fir. We have Douglas. We have lodgepole pine. We have Jeffrey pine. And so it's a complete ecosystem. It's not just these big red trees. Okay, and then the other thing I want to show you, so you remember that little seed. So one of the things that, a very frequent question I get asked is the difference between a redwood and a giant sequoia. Does anybody know where the redwoods grow naturally?
Coast.
Yeah, the coast of California. From historically, they were south to Big Sur on up, just into Oregon. Only, sadly, 4% of the old-growth redwood remains because they were a very good, economically important timber species. So we just pretty much clear-cut those. And so a redwood, one of the big differences is a redwood will sprout from a fallen tree that hasn't quite died will sprout and will have a genetically identical tree. These guys don't. So when you see two trees, so these are twins right here. And I'm going to use the human term twins. They are genetically unique. So those were two seeds. These trees will not grow vegetatively, so they need a genetically unique seed to grow. So wherever you see that. And what I want to show you is where does anybody know what this is? It is a pine cone. Does anybody know what kind of tree this came from? You can't. It's sticky, so that's why it's good to hold on to that. That is a sugar pine cone. So that comes from a tree like that. Now that's a pretty spectacular tree. But this is the cone of a giant sequoia. So
No way.
Giant sequoia cones.
Because I've seen people collecting the big ones. I thought those were the.
Yeah. And so they come in various sizes. And I have one, and I'm going to talk just briefly about a wonderful little creature that we have here. They probably yelled at you. They're called chickarees or Douglas squirrels. And what they do is when the cones are green, they look like this. Okay, and this one is starting to dry on me. But what they do is they'll cut hundreds of these in a single day, and they don't eat the seed. That seed is no nutrients at all. So what they do is they eat the fleshy part of the cone. Very important to helping disperse the seeds of the giant sequoia. And so this would be, so I'm not a botanist, but this would be, a female cone. And this would be the pollen-bearing male cone. These little tiny things on the end here, okay? And so every seed is genetically unique, all right? And so every single tree, even if they're fused at the bottom, started off as 1 or 2 or 3 seeds. So these guys don't sprout vegetatively. All right. So the last thing I'm going to talk about, because people generally want to know, is where did the name General Sherman come from? Does anyone know?
The general.
Does anybody know who? Thank you. Does anybody know? Yes. So William Tecumseh Sherman. So it's got I think, a pretty interesting history behind the name. So the first white man that made a record of seeing this tree, that we know, he made a record, he saw it. He was brought up here with an Indian guide, and he saw this tree, and he was so impressed that he named it after. Wolverton had been a lieutenant in the Union Army, and so he named the tree after a man he considered a great hero, someone that helped bring a bloody Civil War to a faster end, and that is William Tecumseh Sherman. So now if you fast forward a few years into the 1870s, a group of utopian socialists in San Francisco laid claim to this forest. Now keep in mind, 1870, the United States was all about exploiting our resources. It seemed like there would be no end to the mineral wealth, to the tree wealth, and that was really a way that the mindset was we're going to develop our country by exploiting the natural resources. And so there was something called the Timber and Stone Act, and the socialists laid claim to this actual forest with the idea that they're going to harvest these trees as a way to support their commune. And so when they got up here, they didn't like the name, the General Sherman tree, so they renamed the tree after one of their heroes, Karl Marx. And so for a time, this was the Karl Marx tree. And the one thing Americans love to do, and that's to hate socialism and communism. So now we fast forward a little bit more, and people down in the Central Valley and Visalia and Fresno, and a very diverse group, actually, people that don't readily work together for a common purpose, environmentalists, people who wanted to conserve the forest, and farmers. The farmers were worried about what? If this forest was gone, why would that impact farmers, do you think? That's it. So erosion of the soil, the water supply would be spoiled, and they were worried about that. And the people who wanted to preserve this just believed that this should be intact. And so they advocated very energetically for a national park. And mysteriously, and it really is quite mysterious, there's no record that we can find of exactly what the process was. Within a very short amount of time, we had a national park. And so in 1890, Sequoia National Park was born to protect this very grove. And at that time, whoops, that's okay, I'll find more. At that time, there was no National Park Service. So it was what organization that helped protect this from poachers, from people that cut timber illegally, mine illegally, etc. Who do you think would have been equipped to do that?
Audubon Society or no?
The U.S. Army, the cavalry. So the Buffalo Soldiers were up here for a time. Yeah.
Back up with the garage.
Yeah. And so when the U.S. cavalry got here, and they found out that those idealist socialists had renamed it the Karl Marx tree, they didn't like that too much. So they renamed it the General Sherman tree. But we're not going to have a Karl Marx tree in an American national park. That just won't do. And so that's the brief history of the name of this tree. And so that name has stuck. The interesting thing is, if any of you have seen a map of the giant forest, you'll notice the black marks. Those, when I was getting ready for this job and I was doing some research, that's a pretty amazing cone, isn't it? I looked at that map and I thought, oh, well, that area, the Congress Trail, that's where I need to go because that's where the big trees are. There's actually 40,000 giant sequoias, mature giant sequoias in this forest. None any more unique and special than any other, really. I mean, he's just the biggest. And so we disallowed the naming of trees about 45 years ago, 50 years ago, because we didn't want it to be like some of these trees are more important than others. They're all equally precious because they are unique. And thank you. And they only grow on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. They're very, very picky trees. And so they're like Goldilocks. They need it just right. They need enough water, but not too much. And they want it in the form of snow. So we have long snowy winters when we get that thing that falls from the sky that I'm told we call snow and rain. I haven't seen it in a while. So long, actually mild winters. So our average low is only 19 degrees. That's not too bad for our elevation. So abundant snow, long mild summers where it's not too hot, but we don't get rain. And they need to be on a certain, they need to face a certain way. So notice these guys are mostly facing west to pick up an abundant amount of sunshine. And they like decomposed granite. And so that's why you're only going to find 72 groves of giant sequoias from about 40 miles south of here to north of the Placerville area. And nowhere else in the world do they grow in nature. So very picky and very special tree. So they're all truly unique. And so we don't allow naming of them, not here in the national park. The national forest still allows the naming of trees. So if you want to name a tree after yourself or someone that you love, talk to the National Forest Service because they still allow it. So that's the end of my formal presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, because I just really scratched the surface. Yes?
This is the largest tree on the planet. Is it the oldest?
This is not even close to the oldest. So there is a tree, it's a bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of eastern California. Not very far from here as the crow flies, that is close to 6,000 years old. This guy's only 2,200. That's nothing. He's also the fastest growing tree. He's growing, in a single year, he'll grow the equivalent of a tree 6.5 feet in diameter and 60 feet tall. So that's how much volume he's adding every single year, not including his branches. So we don't measure the branches because they fall out. That's a branch right there that fell out. It's huge, 7 feet in diameter, 140 feet long. That was a branch. That was a branch. That would be a record tree in most forests on planet Earth. Yeah.
Is the tree, are there any signs of distress with the recent